Welcome to KINE2253 Motor Development Across the Lifespan. This lecture will discuss the 7th chapter of Lifespan Motor Development, the 7th edition, by Haywood and Getchell. This lecture will provide supplementary examples and explanations to help provide a deeper understanding of the book chapter. In this lecture, students will examine the development of manipulative skills, including reaching and grasping objects, and catching or intercepting objects. They will also examine the developmental transitions and individual constraints that affect the development of manipulative skills. Let's begin by first examining grasping and reaching for objects. Prehension is grasping an object with one or two hands. Halverson in 1931 filmed infants from 16 to 52 weeks of age while grasping a 1-inch cube. The study was then replicated and extended by Holstein in 1982. This figure on the right is from the Holstein paper. Although similar patterns were observed across the two studies, Holstein found that the object's size and shape influenced the type of grasp that was used. At birth, the infant does not attempt to make any contact with the object. After about 1 month, the infant still does not consistently make contact with the object. Around 2 months of age, the infant grasps the objects with the whole hand. The object touches the palm. This is called a power grip if the thumb and fingers are in opposition. Think about holding a dumbbell. You're typically using a power grip to grasp that type of object. Around 3 months of age, the infant begins to adjust the hand position. Around 4 months of age, the infant grasps the object with the thumb on top of the object. Around 5 months of age, the infant grasps the object with just the fingers. This is called a precision grip. Around 9 months, the infant can anticipate and adjust their hand to appropriately grasp an object based on the shape of the object. Newell and colleagues in 1989 examined 4 to 8 month old infants grasping a cube and cups of different dimensions. They found that infants used 5 types of grip about 95% of the time. The specific grip depended on the size and shape of that object. Interestingly, they also found that young infants already exhibited precision grips and that the use of this pattern was chosen for grasping small objects. Lee, Liu, and Newell in 2006 validated these findings in a longitudinal study that examined infants from 9 to 37 weeks. Taken together, these studies demonstrate that prehension is a product of neuromotor maturation as well as task and environmental constraints during infant development. Butterworth, Verwey, and Hopkins in 1997 examined 6 to 20-month-old infants, as these infants picked up cubes and spheres of different sizes. Again, similar to previous studies, these researchers observed a transition from power grips to precision grips and found that after 2 years of age, young children mostly used precision grips to pick up objects. They also found that the object size had a greater influence than the object's shape in the type of grasp that was used. At the beginning of the semester, when we discussed Chapter 2, we described the perception-action coupling and the influence of body scaling and movement selection. Recall that body scaling is when an individual selects a movement based on the relationship between their body and the object size. The results from this study suggest that infants select movements based on the relative size of the object and their own body size. When comparing one-hand to two-hand grasping across age, several researchers have found that there is a relatively constant ratio of hand size to object size when selecting to use one hand or two hands to pick up an object. What I mean by this is that even 3-year-old children appropriately switch from one hand to two-hand grasping when the object becomes too large to successfully grasp with just one hand alone. Visual information about the object's size, shape, and location are necessary for successfully reaching and grasping objects. For example, before they are able to successfully grasp an object, young infants try to knock down objects or reach towards objects of interest. Vision also allows an individual to prepare his or her movements to accurately move to the object and to select the correct grip in anticipation of grasping that object. Several studies have noted that young children, for example 5 to 7-year-olds, rely very heavily on visual feedback to reach and grasp objects accurately. Therefore, the development of accurate reaching and grasping not only happens during infancy, but continues throughout young childhood. Given that there is a stable relationship across development between object and body size. Body scaling allows the individual to modify grip selection across periods of growth. What I mean by this is that movements don't need to be relearned when you go through a growth spurt. All you need to do is modify or adjust the movements depending on the new body scaled ratio of that object. For example, whereas a basketball might be too large for a 12-year-old boy to hold with one hand, after a large growth spurt, he may be able to palm that basketball with one hand alone. This pattern is observed across a lifespan. Even older adults use visual information to plan reaching and grasping objects, such that these movements are scaled to body size, and adjustments and movements are done in advance. Although we have focused on developmental modifications in grasping, obviously, in order to grasp an object, you must first reach for that object and bring it towards you. Now let's discuss reaching in more detail. Developmental changes in reaching start with spontaneous movements of the arms. Similar to what we saw with spontaneous leg movements, which precede kicking and walking, spontaneous movements of the arms precede reaching. Random or reflexive movements are also called pre-reaching and are often observed within the first few months of infancy. Let's watch a video of a newborn neonatal exam to get an idea of what these spontaneous arm movements like in a newborn.
Baby today is a 5-day-old infant who, at this point in time, is in an awake, quiet state with the eyes open, looking. First thing we want to do is just look at movements and look at the baby's tone. The baby is predominantly inflection tone, but has spontaneous movements in the upper extremities and also the lower extremities, and is looking around, having some sucking movements. And so the baby's in the quiet alert state.
So even in the neonate, we see pre-reaching or spontaneous arm movements, which may serve as a foundation for reaching objects later in development. Eventually, pre-reaching or spontaneous movements allow the infant to begin reaching for objects of interest in the environment. Importantly, reaching and grasping is critical for the development of self-feeding, which is achieved around 1 year of age. Obviously, even after 1 year of age, the infant is not very accurate in their reaching, grasping, and bringing food to their face. However, developmental changes in reaching and grasping are not necessarily due to learning the match between vision and proprioception or other sensory information. Rather, it seems that the developmental changes in reaching and grasping are simply a function of learning to control the arm. Okay, so what do I mean by learning to control the arm? Thielen and colleagues in 1993 followed 4 infants from 3 weeks of age to 1 year of age. The setup looked like this. A researcher sat in front of the infant and showed the infant a toy. The infant was connected with infrared sensors that could monitor the shoulder, wrist, elbow, and hand movements. In addition, the infant's muscle activity was also recorded. These researchers found several important features of reaching movements. First, the transition from pre-reaching to reaching occurred around 3 to 4 months of age. As infants learned to explore their environment, they would try different strategies to get towards the toy. Each infant adopted different strategies that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't work. So the transition from pre-reaching to successful reaching didn't necessarily follow a straightforward or linear progression. Sometimes reaches got worse before they got better. Through these many months of practice, infants learned by doing. They created different solutions to different movement problems. As we saw in the previous slide, one function of reaching and grasping is the development of being able to feed oneself. We start to see the development of hand or object-to-mouth movements as early as 3 to 4 months of age. The infant will bring his hand to his or her mouth or face, with or without an object in hand. By about 5 months, the infant opens their mouth in anticipation of the hand or object's arrival. Throughout the first year of infancy, as we see improvements in reaching and manipulation, we also see refinements in the ability to bring food to the mouth. The development of bimanual control is also critical. For example, one must use both hands when an object is too large for one hand to grasp or manipulate. The development of bimanual skill occurs within the first year. Bimanual control is also necessary when you need each hand to perform complementary movements. For example, holding a jar with one hand while using the other hand to open the lid. The development of complementary movements with the two hands doesn't emerge until the second year. Let's examine these two types of bimanual functions in more detail. Developmental changes in bimanual reaching begins around 2 months of age, when we start to see synchronized, non-reaching, or spontaneous bimanual movements. What I mean by this is that the arms flail or move together, but they are not purposeful movements. Within a few months, infants begin to clasp their hands at midline. By around 4.5 months of age, infants begin to reach for objects with both arms. This is not necessarily because of the object size. The arms just move more synchronously around that time. Corbetta and Thielen in 1996 examined the development of bimanual control during the first year. Infants begin to fluctuate through periods of only reaching with one hand, or unimanual control, to only reaching with both hands, or bimanual control. But there's no systematic shift from reaching with one hand or two hands. Now that we have discussed the development of reaching, let's shift gears and talk more about hand control and the development of manipulation. Around 8 months of age, infants use their hands cooperatively. For example, they clap their hands or they hold large objects with both hands together. Around 12 months of age, infants start to pull objects apart and insert one object into another or bang objects together. Around 2 years of age, infants begin to use objects as tools. What I mean by this is they start to use utensils to get food, or they start to use toy hammers to build things. Around 18 months of age, infants can perform complementary movements with the two hands together. Again, what I mean by this is that one hand will perform one task that will help the other hand perform another task. For example, holding a jar with one hand while trying to use the other hand to open the lid. One thing that is important to highlight is that the development of reaching and manipulation is dependent on the ability to control your posture. For example, if I'm not stable and I reach for an object, I could fall over. Because we cannot reach or manipulate objects without good postural control or without postural support, we can say that posture is a rate limiter for reaching, meaning that we cannot reach until we have developed postural support. At 4 months of age, infants begin to adjust their posture when they reach. What I mean by this is that their trunk muscles activate to hold their torso up when the infant begins to reach. Infants also learn to lean their body forward to facilitate reaching. In both of these cases, the baby's body must be supported either by an adult or by a supportive chair. Around 6 or 7 months of age, infants can begin to sit independently and can begin to reach without support. Now that we know a bit about the development of reaching and prehension in infants and young children, let's now shift gears to talk about age-related changes in manipulation and coordination in older adults. Information about the developmental changes in manual tasks in older adults come from both cross-sectional and longitudinal studies. Remember that cross-sectional studies typically compare one age group to another. Kronauer and Van Heranta in 1996 examined the performance of a movement assessment in adults ages 21 to 70. They found reduced reaction time, movement speed, and coordination after age 50. Contreras-Vidal and colleagues in 1998 found that coordination for writing skills also declines in older adults ages 60 to 70 compared with younger adults. In longitudinal studies, we follow the same individuals over time. One longitudinal study by Hughes and colleagues in 1998 reported that individuals around the age of 78 show a progressive decline in grip strength and increased time to complete manual tasks. Loss of manipulation skills may be due to a reduced level of activity with age. When we look specifically at age-related changes in reaching and aiming performance, we see that movement patterns also change from young adults to older adults. When reaching for objects, the acceleration and deceleration phases of the movement are symmetrical in young adults. In contrast, older adults do not accelerate as much initially and have a much longer deceleration time and make many more adjustments at the end of the movement to reach the target. This means that older adults spend more time trying to get to the target and have difficulty incorporating feedback to reach targets accurately. Because of these problems during just the performance of a single movement, for example, reaching to one object, When movements need to be sequenced together, this is also very problematic for older adults. For example, an increase in movement time necessary to complete one movement will accumulate over many sequential movements subsequently. Therefore, similar to other movement skills that we previously examined, like golf or tennis, continual practice is necessary to maintain aiming and reaching skills. Okay, before we move on to catching, let's sum up what we have learned so far about the development of reaching and manipulative skills. First, developmental changes in reaching and prehension occur over the first 2 years of life. Infants go from spontaneous movements of one or both arms to being able to reach accurately for objects with one or both arms over the first year of life. The use of one or the other arm depends on the size of that object. Over the next year of life, infants begin to use both hands together in complementary ways and begin to use objects as tools. These skills are necessary for self-feeding and interacting with one's environment. The way in which infants learn to reach and manipulate objects doesn't necessarily follow a precise pattern, but rather is individually specific and depends on the infant's biomechanics. Second, older adults show age-related decrements in their ability to reach and perform manipulative skills. It's important for those older adults to continue practicing and performing manipulative skills so they can maintain skills over time.